On January 30th, 1925, cave explorer Floyd Collins crawled into a narrow Kentucky crevice, looking for a future. But just 60 feet below the surface, Floyd's journey ended in a heartbeat. It wasn't a cave-in that stopped him, but a single 27-pound stone trapping his leg. This tiny sliver of earth became the stage for a 17-day nightmare. For the next 2 weeks, thousands of volunteers and rescue workers fought the mountain, helping in any way they can. But the rock was unmovable, the passages too tight, and the mountain too unstable. This wasn't a local story. This single man's struggle became the biggest news story in the world. The tragedy was so profound that he climbed all the way to the highest office in the land.
Collins had been trapped in a Kentucky cave by a falling boulder, and the whole nation wanted to know from hour to hour what progress his rescuers were making.
This is the story of Floyd Collins, the man who changed cave exploring forever. William Floyd Collins was born on July 20, 1887 in Logan County, Kentucky. From a young age, he was captivated by the hidden world beneath his feet, exploring the many caves in his family's land and the countryside. At just 6, he was already venturing into the darkness, searching for Native American artifacts to sell to tourists. This wasn't just a hobby, it was his life's passion. By his early 20s, he was a skilled explorer, helping a geologist discover several caves in the area, including Doss's Dome Cave and Great Onyx Cave. Collins was known for his incredible endurance, often spending over 30 hours in caves before even starting to explore. He was a seasoned and talented caver, and despite a few close calls, including an incident where his light went out, he always managed to escape danger. However, the 1920s in rural Kentucky offered almost no steady means of earning a living. For many farmers, including the Collins family, low crop prices and mounting debts created a climate of financial desperation. In this struggle, the earth itself became a battlefield, giving rise to an intense regional conflict known as the Kentucky Cave Wars. More than 24 rival commercial caves fiercely competed with the famous Mammoth Cave for tourist money. The competition was ruthless. Cave owners used misleading advertising and hired solicitors known as cave capers to line the highways and redirect tourists to their businesses. This economic pressure is not just a historical backdrop. It is the direct cause behind Floyd's tragic decision. His final act of exploration was not a personal whim, but a desperate move to secure his family's financial survival in a brutal economic landscape. In 1917, Floyd discovered a magnificent cave on his family's land, which he named Crystal Cave. It was a breathtaking discovery, filled with unique formations and immense natural beauty. He and his family worked to commercialize the cave, turning it into a promising tourist attraction. However, the venture had the critical fatal flaw: its remote location. Crystal Cave lacked the ease of access needed to compete with the show caves that could afford to hire cave capers. The business struggled, and the steady income his family had hoped for never materialized. The failure of this dream was the tinderbox for the events to come. Facing rising debts and the fading promise of Crystal Cave, Floyd devised a new plan. He struck a deal with a neighbor to explore a small cave on his property known as Sand Cave. This new cave had the ultimate prize. Its location was right beside Cave City Road, a prime spot for catching the tourist traffic headed to Mammoth Cave. Collins' motivation was clear. He was on a solo expedition to find a new, more accessible show cave that could finally provide his family with a secure income. It was a gamble with everything at stake. On the morning of January 30th, 1925, armed with a single kerosene lantern, Floyd Collins embarked on his journey. Sand Cave was a far cry from the beautiful crystalline formation of his family's cave. It was an unstable breakdown cave, characterized by narrow twisting passages. He had to inch his way forward on his stomach, pushing his lantern ahead of him as he navigated a crawl so tight that he had to keep one arm stretched out and the other pinned to his side. After hours, he was finally able to find a large chamber, a potential discovery that could be his family's salvation. But soon after, a terrifying sign appeared. His lantern began to flicker. For a caver, the loss of light means the loss of life. Collins knew this and began a hasty retreat before total darkness could consume him. During this moment of frantic retreat, a series of unfortunate events transpired. In the confined and narrow passage, he misplaced his foot. This small error dislodged a 27-pound rock, which fell and wedged his left ankle in place. Trapped 55 to 60 feet below the surface, he was caught in what was later described as a stone straitjacket. In his desperate struggle to free himself, his attempts only made his situation worse. A torrent of loose gravel and rubble buried him up to his waist. The initial entrapment was only the beginning. His heroic self-burial was the final, devastating blow. The darkness was now absolute. When Floyd didn't return home, his family and neighbors grew worried and began a desperate search. They found his jacket outside the entrance of the cave and soon heard his faint calls for help from within. But the passages were dangerously tight, and only a small 17-year-old boy named Joel Estes was able to crawl far enough to communicate with him, confirming his entrapment. The initial rescue efforts were immediately chaotic and disorganized. Floyd's brothers, Homer and Marshall, were the primary rescuers. Homer was the first to reach Floyd, navigating the terrifying passage named the Squeeze that most men found impossible. He found Floyd laying on his stomach in the mud, cold and exhausted. Homer spent hours in the mud, removing debris from Floyd's face and chest by hand, one pebble at a time. On February 1st, a local rescue team attempted a brute force extraction. They managed to feed the harness down the narrow shaft. At the surface, a group of men began to haul him up. However, the physics of the cave worked against them. Because the passage turned at a sharp angle just above Floyd, pulling on the rope didn't lift him out. It pulled his chest against the ceiling, while his trapped leg remained jammed. Floyd's screams of agony echoed through the cave, and the attempt came to a stop. At this point in time, the tragedy was no longer a personal struggle. It was now a matter of public knowledge, and the world was about to take notice. Within days of his entrapment, news of a man trapped in a Kentucky cave began to spread across the country. Just 3 days later, the story had now captured the nation's attention, becoming the top news story of the day. This was a new kind of sensation. Amidst the growing chaos, the Louisville Courier-Journal dispatched a young William Skeets Miller, who was 21 years old at the time, to cover the story. Because of his small and slender frame, weighing only 117 pounds, Miller was one of the few individuals who could squeeze down the dangerously narrow passage, and over the next 3 days, he made 16 trips down to Floyd. Miller's vivid, first-person dispatches from deep within the earth brought a human face to the men below. He not only reported on the events, but also became an active participant in the rescue, feeding Floyd milk and coffee through a rubber tube and even attempting to remove the smaller rocks. As news of the entrapment spread, thousands of spectators descended upon Sand Cave, turning the tragic rescue site into a grim carnival. Vendors appeared, selling hot dogs, coffee and souvenirs. The spectacle was so large that the Kentucky National Guard had to be called in to maintain order. The carnival atmosphere was far from being a harmless sideline. It was actively hindering the rescue efforts. The sheer number of people created a physical and emotional conflict between the locals and the outlanders. The locals were familiar with the cave's geology and the dangerous reality of the situation. The outsiders, however, viewed the event as a thrilling spectacle. This clash of perspectives between those who knew the man and those who knew the story amplified the chaos and hindered an efficient rescue effort. After nearly a week of desperate rescue attempts, a second cave-in sealed the original passage. The unstable ceiling, weakened by the constant traffic and moisture from the rescuer's breath, finally gave way. The passage to Floyd was now completely sealed by tons of wet earth and rock. Floyd was now alone, and all hope of a direct rescue was lost. Marshall Collins, in a last desperate attempt, offered a reward of $500, which would amount to $10,000 in today's money, to anyone who could rescue his brother. However, with the cave now impassable, a new and final plan was forced. The governor of Kentucky appointed Henry Carmichael, a veteran railroad engineer, to lead the effort. Carmichael determined that the only way to reach Floyd was to dig a 55-foot vertical shaft down to a point just behind Floyd's location. Over 75 men, miners from the nearby coalfields and local volunteers, worked in shifts. The process was slow and physically demanding. The natural inward flow of air in the cave prevented the use of any mechanical drilling equipment, as the fumes would have suffocated Floyd. The entire shaft had to be dug by hand with nothing but pickaxes and shovels. As the agonizing days turned into a second week, the digging continued. On February 11th, a heart-wrenching sign confirmed the worst fears. The light bulb at the end of the wire leading to Floyd went out. There was no way to confirm if he was still alive. For 5 more days, the brave rescuers continued their tireless work, driven by a sliver of hope. Finally, on February 16, 1925, after a grueling 17-day ordeal, a miner named Ed Brenner broke through the final wall. He reached Floyd, finding him cold and apparently dead. It was estimated that he had succumbed to exposure, starvation and hypothermia just 3 days earlier. He had died in total darkness, with the sound of rescuers' pickaxes ringing in his ears just a few feet away. After his death was confirmed, Sand Cave was deemed too dangerous to enter, and it was sealed with Floyd's body still inside. But the story of Floyd Collins was far from over. Driven by a fierce desire for a proper burial, his brother Homer toured the country, telling Floyd's story on the vaudeville stage to raise money for his brother's retrieval. Months later, the body was finally recovered and buried on the Collins family farm. The cave wars, however, had one last, bizarre and deeply ironic chapter to write. In 1927, the property was sold to Dr. H.B. Thomas, a dentist and cave owner, who made a controversial decision. He had Floyd's body moved and displayed in a glass-topped coffin inside Crystal Cave to attract tourists. The very commercial forces that drove his tragic act continued to victimize him even after his death. His body became the ultimate tourist attraction, a physical embodiment of the cave wars he had so desperately sought to escape. It was not until 1989, more than 60 years after his death, that Floyd Collins' body was finally laid to rest in a proper grave at Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery. But the story of his life and death had a profound impact. His death spurred a revolution in cave exploration safety. Cavers adopted new rules, such as never caving alone and always using proper equipment with multiple light sources. Greatest cave explorer ever known. These words are engraved on his tombstone, a title he earned not for what he discovered, but for the profound lessons learned from his final tragic journey.